Start of a purge at the top of Russia's military establishment. The Moscow Times and Financial Times have reported that General Sergei Surovikin has been arrested on suspicion of involvement in Yevgeny Prigozhin and his Wagner Group's failed rebellion. The New York Times also says Surovikin had advanced knowledge of Prigozhin's plans.
He was once the face of Russia's war in Ukraine. Sergei Surovikin, nicknamed General Armageddon for his brutality. Putin sent him to Ukraine to turn the tide. He took command of an army in crisis, in retreat and reeling after defeats on the battlefield. Surovikin began making his reputation in Chechnya in the 2000s, where he ordered reprisals against civilians. He then commanded forces in Syria in support of its government. He oversaw the brutal bombing of rebel-held Aleppo in 2016. The following year, Putin awarded him the Hero of Russia Medal, the country's highest honour. With Surovikin in command in Ukraine, Russian forces changed tactics. As winter set in, they began to target Ukraine's energy infrastructure, plunging millions into darkness and cold, and leaving them without water. Putin was pleased, giving Surovikin yet another medal, but just a month later, he relieved him of command. This man, Valery Gerasimov, took his job, and Surovikin became his deputy. When the Wagner Group made its march on Moscow, Surovikin loyally towed the line.
I urge you to stop. The enemy is just waiting for the internal political situation to worsen in our country.
The question now is whether he knew more than he was letting on.
For more on this story, let's get comment from John Teichert, a retired brigadier general who recently served as Assistant Deputy Undersecretary of the U.S. Air Force International Affairs. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Claire, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
We should say there's no official confirmation of the fate of Surovikin. Does it look to you, though, like Putin has started cleaning house?
So I think the biggest surprise in this is that we haven't seen more harsh measures by Putin. I do believe that he's probably been detained and is being investigated. But really what Putin needs to do to reestablish his authority is something that is far more grandiose than just a couple of interrogations and arrests. And I'm surprised we haven't seen that in the last 4 days or so.
Indeed, if it is true that Surovikin, one of Russia's top generals, knew about the mutiny and didn't try to stop it, what does that tell us about Putin's grip on power here?
Well, I think if you're going to be an authoritarian, you need to have authority. And I think it's interesting to see that there are probably many that sympathize with Prigozhin's thoughts about frustration and how the war in Ukraine has played out. And I think it indicates that this authoritarian leader in Putin probably has a whole lot less authority than maybe we would have expected 6 days ago.
What would you have potentially expected from Putin to assert that authority?
So I think that he needs to do some, in order to do what Putin does successfully, be very strong and strident in his crackdowns amongst those within the security establishment in Russia to demonstrate his authority and to purge out those that are not loyal. And the fact that he doesn't or hasn't done that up to this point is probably indicative of the fact that Putin himself questions whether he has the authority and the ability to actually crack down to the extent that he thinks that he probably needs to.
So let's talk about the stakes here. We've heard Josep Borrell, the EU's top diplomat, warning that a weaker Putin is a greater danger. What is your take? Is a more unstable Russia a more dangerous Russia here?
I think in this case, Putin has a couple of options. One of them would be to undertake this crackdown that I think maybe he's showing part of now. But I think if he ultimately wants to regain authority, he has to do something more grandiose. And one of those things could be to lash out externally outside of Russia. I think that's the danger that Joseph is talking about there. But I think the better play for Putin would be to undertake a crackdown amongst the security forces there in Russia, and maybe consider using this as a pretext to bring troops home from a failing war in Ukraine and show more security establishment presence on the streets of Moscow and around Russia. And I think one of those things is the only play for Putin now, and hopefully he'll take the one that's more reasonable by bringing troops home.
Yeah, how likely do you think that could be as an outcome?
Yeah, so I think ultimately Putin is looking at himself in the mirror and thinking about the last 16 months in Ukraine. And I think he realizes that while maybe we would have otherwise thought that time was on the side of Russia in this war, that probably now it's more apparent that time is on the side of Ukraine. And that the longer it takes for Putin to establish his aims in Ukraine, the less likely he is to be able to hold on to the authority that he desires. And maybe now this is the right pretext for him to pull troops home and establish his presence within Russia instead of meddling outside of Russia.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us on DW News. That is retired Brigadier General John Teichert. Really appreciate your insights.
Thanks, Claire.